Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 11 on personality. Let's dive in. Why do some people stay calm under pressure while others snap? Why is one person naturally outgoing and impulsive and someone else more cautious, private, and controlled? How much of that is just who we are versus what we've learned to be? In this chapter, we're going to look at how psychologists define personality, which is the consistent patterns in how you think, feel, and behave, and how different theories try to explain where those patterns come from. We'll talk about unconscious drives, learning and environment, biological traits, culture, and the idea that we each have certain stable characteristics that can be measured. By the end of this chapter, you'll hopefully start to see personality not as a label or a quiz result, but as something that develops, shows up in relationships, and can predict how we're likely to move through the world. When we talk about personality, we're talking about the consistent way that you think, feel, and behave across different situations. In other words, personality is not just what you did today when you were tired or annoyed. It's the pattern that shows up over time. Some people are generally loud and impulsive, some people are generally careful and private, and most people land somewhere in the middle and stay pretty stable across their lifetime. Personality also helps explain why two people can go through the same situation and respond in completely different ways. One person might see a challenge and get excited, another might shut down and avoid it completely. That's part of why psychology studies personality in the first place. If we can understand a person's pattern, we can start to predict the kinds of choices they are likely to make, how they tend to solve problems, and what they're like in relationships. One of the earliest attempts to explain personality goes all the way back to Hippocrates and later Galen. They believed the body had four major fluids, or humors, and that the balance of those fluids shaped both health and temperament. So the idea was who you are emotionally is connected to what's happening inside your body. They described the four main temperaments. So if someone had too much yellow bile, they would be described as irritable, angry, intense, and quick to react. Too much black bile was linked to being more serious, sad, anxious, and withdrawn. High levels of blood were tied to being outgoing, energetic, social, and optimistic. And high levels of phlegm were linked to being calm, steady, reliable, and maybe a little emotionally flat or slow to get worked up. Now, obviously, this is not how we explain personality today. We don't diagnose people based on body fluids, but what I want you to notice is the move that they were already making, that even that early on, they were trying to describe consistent patterns in how people tend to act and feel, and they were trying to link those patterns to something physical. Another early attempt to explain personality was called phrenology. In the late 1700s, Franz Gall proposed that you could understand a person's personality, character, and mental abilities by feeling the bumps and shapes on their skull. The idea was that different parts of the brain controlled different traits, and if one area was more developed, it would push out on the skull in that one spot. So in theory, you could map the skull and learn things like how aggressive, honest, or intelligent someone was. This sounds scientific on the surface. It uses anatomy and measures things, but it was eventually discredited because it didn't have real evidence behind it. There was no solid data showing that these bumps actually lined up with the traits that he claimed. So, as a theory of personality, phrenology is not accepted. But that being said, I do want you to notice what Gall was doing that carried forward. He was arguing that different mental functions live in different parts of the brain. That basic idea that certain areas of the brain are linked to certain abilities or tendencies is something modern neuroscience still supports. So even though phrenology itself was wrong, it pushed psychology toward asking, can we connect parts of the brain to certain patterns in behavior? As thinking about personality developed, people moved away from ideas like body fluids and skull shape and started focusing on describing stable patterns in behavior. Immanuel Kant argued that people could be grouped into basic temperaments based on their typical emotional style and behavior. The goal was to capture how a person tends to act and feel in general, not just in one moment. William Wundt added to this by suggesting that personality could be mapped along two major axes. One axis was emotional versus non-emotional, which separated the strong emotion temperaments from the calmer temperaments, and the other axis was changeable versus unchangeable, which separated temperaments that were more reactive and flexible from temperaments that are more steady and stable. Another major perspective came from Freud. We talk about him frequently in psychology. Freud argued that personality is shaped by the unconscious, thoughts, urges, fears, and conflicts that you're not fully aware of, but that still have influence on how you behave. From this view, people are not always driven by what they say they want or what they think they're choosing. A reaction that feels random or out of nowhere might come from something underneath awareness. Freud also believed early childhood experiences matter because that is when basic internal conflicts start forming. According to this view, you have instinctual drives, you learn what is acceptable and what is not, and you carry that tension forward. That ongoing push and pull becomes part of your personality. This perspective is called psychodynamic because it focuses on internal psychological forces and how they create ongoing conflict inside the person. According to Freud, a lot of what drives personality lives in the unconscious, which is mental activity that we're not aware of and cannot directly access. He argued that we are only aware of a small part of our mind, basically the part that we can think and talk about on purpose, and most of it is actually hidden. The hidden part includes unacceptable urges and desires, and those get pushed down and kept out of awareness through repression. Even though we don't consciously know all of what's in there, that material still impacts our behavior. Freud also believed that sometimes the unconscious leaks out. He called this a Freudian slip. For example, when someone accidentally says something aggressive or sexual or revealing and then brushes it off as a mistake or a joke. From this point of view, the slip is not actually random. It's the unconscious showing itself for a second. Freud described personality as an ongoing effort to balance two kinds of forces: basic instinctual drives on one side and internalized rules and self-control on the other. He said this balance shows up through three interacting systems: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id is the first part of the mind that contains our most primitive urges, so hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. The id is impulsive and wants satisfaction right here, right now. It operates on the pleasure principle, which means it seeks instant gratification. The superego develops as we learn social rules about right and wrong. It acts as a kind of moral compass. The superego judges our behavior and can make us feel pride when we meet the standards or guilt when we don't. The ego is part of the self that tries to manage both. The ego is rational and works on the reality principle, meaning it tries to help the id get what it wants in a way that is socially acceptable and realistic, while also keeping the superego satisfied. The ego is the part of the personality that other people actually see. In Freud's view, a healthy personality depends on balance. When the id and superego are both being managed well by ego, the person is generally able to function, make decisions, and handle urges without a lot of constant stress. When the id and superego are not balanced, problems start to show up. Freud believed that an imbalance could lead to neurosis, which is a tendency to experience strong negative emotions, anxiety, or patterns of behavior that aren't necessarily healthy. An easy way to picture this is to imagine being pulled in two directions. The id is, I want it now. The superego is, you shouldn't want that at all. If the ego can step in and find a realistic middle ground, something that respects limits but still meets the need in an acceptable way, the person looks flexible and stable. If the ego cannot do that, however, you either get someone who gives in to every impulse and then deals with the fallout later, or someone who is so controlled and self-critical that they're constantly anxious and feeling guilty. Freud would say that's what it looks like when the system is out of balance or misaligned. Freud argued that the ego uses defense mechanisms to reduce anxiety and keep things under control. Defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies the mind uses to protect us from stress, conflict, or feelings we don't want to face. The goal is to reduce tension and keep some kind of balance between the id and the superego. But please know that defense mechanisms in and of themselves are not inherently bad. Freud believed everybody uses them, and they're part of how we cope with things. The problem, in his view, is when they get overused or become the only way that a person deals with stress or the imbalances. At that point, they can interfere with healthy functioning instead of helping it. Freud believed that personality develops through a series of psychosexual stages in childhood. In each stage, the child's pleasure-seeking energy, what he tied to the id, is focused on a different erogenous zone or area of the body. He also believed that if a child didn't get the right kind of nurturing or resolution at a certain stage, they could become fixated, meaning part of their personality would get stuck there. The first stage is the oral stage from birth to about at 1 year old. The focus here is the mouth. Pleasure comes from sucking and eating. The main conflict is in this stage is weaning, so being separated from the breast or the bottle. According to Freud, if that process doesn't go well, the person might grow up with an oral fixation like overeating, smoking, or nail biting. The second stage is the anal stage from about 1 to 3 years old. Here, the focus is the anus, and the pleasure is from the bowel and bladder control. The conflict in this stage is toilet training. Freud argued that the way caregivers handle toilet training can show up later in personality. He described two patterns: an anal retentive style, which is stingy, stubborn, rigid, and overly neat, and an anal expulsive style, which is messy, disorganized, careless, and more emotionally explosive. The next stage is the phallic stage, around ages 3 to 6. The focus is the genitals. Freud said that during this stage, the child develops a desire for the opposite sex parent and feels jealousy or resentment toward the same sex parent. He called the pattern in boys the Oedipus complex, which is the desire for the mother combined with fear of being punished by the father, which he called castration anxiety. For girls, he described the Electra complex, involving desire for the father, anger at the mother, and what he called penis envy. According to Freud, if this stage is not resolved well, the adult personality might lean toward vanity or overambition. After that comes the latency stage, roughly ages 6 to 12. In latency, sexual feelings are not the focus. Energy is instead directed into school, hobbies, friendships, and generally spending time with same-sex peers. Then comes the genital stage, beginning in adolescence. The focus returns to the genitals, but now in a more mature way. Sexual interest shifts towards age-appropriate partners outside of the family. And at this point, personality is considered mostly formed. Adler developed what he called individual psychology, which focuses on our drive to compensate for feelings of inferiority. In this view, a lot of human behavior comes from trying to overcome the sense that we're not good enough, not strong enough, or not measuring up. Adler called this the inferiority complex, the feeling that you lack worth and don't meet the standards of other people or of society. When that feeling is strong, a person may overcompensate or act in ways that are really about covering insecurity. Adler also believed that social connection is central. He argued that our motives are social. Our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are shaped by our need to belong, to contribute, and to feel valued in a group. He emphasized the importance of relationships and cooperation in childhood, not just biological drives. He believed that happiness is tied to working together for the good of others, and he described the goal of psychology as recognizing the equal worth and equal rights of other people. Erikson proposed a psychosocial theory of development. He believed that personality develops across the entire lifespan, not just in early childhood. At each stage of life, we face a social or relationship-based challenge, and how we handle that challenge shapes part of our personality. Erikson described 8 stages, and at each stage, the task is about building a sense of competency, the feeling that you can handle yourself and function in the world. According to this view, a healthy personality depends on moving through each stage successfully. If a stage goes well, you build confidence and a stronger sense of identity, and if it doesn't, that can create a sense of insecurity that carries forward. Jung developed what he called analytical psychology. He believed that a healthy personality comes from finding balance between conscious thoughts, the things that we're aware of, and unconscious material. Jung agreed that each person has a personal unconscious, but he also introduced the idea of a collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is the shared mental material we inherit as human beings, universal patterns, themes, and memory traces that show up across cultures. Within that collective unconscious, Jung described archetypes. Archetypes are recurring patterns or images that appear in stories, symbols, religion, art, and myths all over the world. He saw these as reflecting common human experiences. Jung also talked about the persona, which he described as a kind of mask that we present to the world. The persona is a compromise between who we actually are and who we believe we're expected to be. It helps us function socially, but it can also hide parts of ourselves that don't match what other people want from us. Jung also introduced the idea of two basic orientations towards life, extroversion and introversion. He described these as not good or bad, but as typical directions of energy and attention. Extroversion is oriented outward towards other people, activity, stimulation, and engagement with the external world. Introversion is oriented inward towards thought, reflection, and the inner world. For Jung, this wasn't just shy versus outgoing. It was about where you naturally focus and recharge. Someone more introverted tends to pull back to think, process, and regain energy alone. Someone more extroverted tends to seek interaction, respond to the environment, and gain energy from being around other people. He treated these as core attitudes that shape how a person approaches life. Karen Horney agreed with the basic idea that people have the ability to move toward psychological health and a stronger sense of self, but she challenged parts of Freud's view on gender. She argued that what had been labeled as penis envy was not biological jealousy. She said those differences between men and women are mostly cultural, based on power, roles, and expectations. She even suggested that men experience what she called womb envy, meaning men may feel tension or insecurity because they physically cannot carry and give birth to children. A major focus for Horney was anxiety. She believed that when children's basic needs for safety, love, and security are not met, they developed what she called basic anxiety. That anxiety can shape personality. She described three common coping styles that people learn in response. One is moving towards people, seeking approval, support, and reassurance, and later, as an adult, needing love and acceptance intensely. The second is moving against people, using anger, control, or aggression, and as an adult, lashing out or exploiting others to protect yourself. The third is moving away from people, withdrawing, staying emotionally distant, avoiding closeness, and later as an adult, avoiding relationships in order to feel safe. These styles are ways of surviving anxiety, but they can become rigid patterns in adulthood. The behavioral perspective focuses on what we can observe, which is our behavior. This approach says that personality is not some hidden inner self, it's the pattern of behaviors we have learned over time. Skinner argued that we learn to behave in certain ways because of reinforcement and consequences in our environment. If a behavior is rewarded, we're more likely to repeat it, and if a behavior is punished, we're less likely to repeat it. Over time, those learned responses start to look like who we are. From this view, personality is not fixed at one point in childhood. It develops across the entire lifespan as we keep having new experiences and being shaped by new consequences. That also means personality can change when the situation changes. If the environment around you changes, like a new job, new relationships, or new expectations, your behavior can shift, and what people experience as your personality can tend to shift with it. Bandura agreed that personality is also shaped by learning, but he said learning alone isn't enough to explain it. He emphasized thinking. The social cognitive perspective says personality comes both from learning and cognition, things like beliefs, expectations, and how we interpret what's happening around us. In other words, it's not just what happens to you, but it's also how you understand it. Bandura describes several factors in personality development. One is the reciprocal determinism, which is the idea that three things are constantly affecting each other. Your own cognitive process, which is your beliefs, expectations, and personality characteristics, your behavior, which are the things that you're actually doing, and the situation or the context that you're in. Another piece is observational learning. We don't only learn by being rewarded or punished ourselves, we also learn by watching what happens to other people and seeing which behaviors are accepted, valued, or discouraged in our cultures. Bandura also talked about self-efficacy, which is your belief in your ability to handle challenges. Self-efficacy develops through social experience and it affects how you approach difficult tasks, whether you avoid them or step into them. Bandura used the term reciprocal determinism to capture how behavior is not one directional. The idea is that your behavior, your thoughts, and your feelings in the situation are all influencing one another at the same time. For example, how you interpret a situation affects how you act in it. How you act in it then changes the situation. And the situation you end up in affects how you think and feel about yourself. This is different from saying the situation controls you, and it's also different from saying you control everything. It's definitely more of an interaction. Your internal process, your behavior in the moment, and the environment you're in are linked. So picture someone who feels socially awkward and expects people won't like them. Because of that, they keep their head down and give short answers when someone talks to them. Other people read that as disinterest and don't really engage back. That reinforces that reaction, then confirms, see, people don't like me. And the cycle continues. That loop is the reciprocal determinism. Julian Rotter introduced the idea of locus of control, which is about what you believe drives the outcome of your life. Locus of control exists on a continuum from internal to external. Someone with an internal locus of control tends to believe that what happens to them mostly comes from their own effort and choices. People on the internal side are more likely to see success as something they can produce. According to this view, that's linked to doing better academically, achieving more in work settings, being more independent, having better health, and showing less depression. Someone with an external locus of control tends to believe that outcomes are mostly outside of their control, controlled by luck, other people, or even by chance. Rotter treated locus of control as a cognitive factor that shapes both learning and personality development. The way you explain why things happen to me becomes a part of how you operate. Walter Mischel challenged the idea that people behave the same no matter where they are. He found that behavior can be inconsistent across different situations, but much more consistent within the same kind of situation over time. In other words, a person might not act the same at home, at school, and with friends, but they tend to act predictably each time they're in a similar type of situation. That raised a question: is personality something stable inside the person, or is it mainly about the situation that they're in? This is known as the person-situation debate. Mischel is also known for the marshmallow study, which looked at self-regulation, or the ability to delay gratification. Young children were put in a room with one marshmallow and told they could eat it now, or they could wait and get two marshmallows when the researcher came back. Some kids waited, some didn't. When those kids were followed later, the children who were better at delaying gratification in preschool tended to do better in high school with better performance and fewer behavior problems. The point Mischel made was that people don't just react automatically. They interpret the situation, they think about what it means, and they act in line with that interpretation. So cognition, how you're understanding what's happening right now, is part of our personality. The humanistic approach looks at personality by focusing on healthy development, on growth, potential, and the ability to become more fully yourself. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, this perspective asks what helps people become stable, compassionate, grounded, and capable of meaning. Abraham Maslow studied people he considered psychologically healthy, creative, and productive. He looked at figures like Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. He found that they tended to share certain characteristics. They were open, creative, confident, comfortable with their values, compassionate, able to care about other people, and generally accepting of themselves. The idea is that personality can reflect movement towards higher level needs, not just survival, but purpose. Carl Rogers focused on the self concept, meaning your thoughts and feelings about who you are. He said we all carry two versions of the self. The ideal self is the person you would like to be, the real self is the person you are right now. Rogers believed that psychological health comes from congruence, which means that the two selves line up. Who you actually are matches pretty closely with who you're trying to be. High congruence supports self-worth in a productive life. Low congruence, when there's a big gap between the real self and the ideal self, shows up as distress and difficulty functioning. The biological approach looks at personality as something that is at least partly shaped by biology, things that we inherit in basic physiological processes. The basic claim is that some differences between people are not just learned from experience, some of those differences are built in as predispositions. A lot of this comes from twin research. In a Minnesota study of twins reared apart, researchers looked at identical twins who were separated and raised in different homes, even when they grew up in different environments. Those twins still showed very similar personalities. That finding suggests that certain traits are inheritable, or heritable, meaning they are influenced by genetics and not only by our upbringing. Some traits show especially strong heritability with estimates above zero point 0.5. Traits in that range include things like leadership, the tendency to follow rules and being orderly, the desire to seek out social contact, emotional well-being, feeling alienated or disconnected, ability to handle stress, and general fearfulness. The point here is not everything is genetic, but that biology clearly contributes to stable aspects of personality. Another part of the biological view of personality is temperament. Temperament shows up very early in life, which suggests that there's a biological basis to it. Even in infancy, some babies are calm and flexible, some are intense and reactive, and some take longer to adjust to new situations. These are often described as easy, difficult, or slow to warm. Temperament reflects two key dimensions that continue into adulthood. One is reactivity, which is how strongly you respond to new or challenging situations. And the other is self-regulation, which is your ability to control your responses. So if something stressful happens, how fast do you react? And how much can you manage that reaction? The environment still matters. Experiences and maturation can shape how temperament gets expressed, but that part of personality starts with these built-in tendencies. William Sheldon suggested that body type or somatotype could be linked to personality as well. He described three main body types and claimed each one tends to line up with a certain style of behavior. According to his view, endomorphs, people with rounder, softer body types, were described as relaxed, comfortable, good-humored, even-tempered, sociable, and tolerant. Mesomorphs, or are a more muscular, athletic build, were described as adventurous, assertive, competitive, and fearless. And ectomorphs, which is a thinner, more delicate build, were described as anxious, self-conscious, artistic, thoughtful, quiet, and more private. Trait theorists focus on the idea that people show consistent traits, stable ways of thinking and behaving, like being optimistic or pessimistic, sociable or shy. Gordon Allport started by looking at language. He identified about 4,500 words in English that people use to describe one another. He sorted them into three levels. Cardinal traits are rare traits that dominate a person's entire personality. Central traits are the core traits that make up most of who you are. Secondary traits are less obvious and more situation dependent, like specific preferences or attitudes that only show up in certain contexts. Raymond Cattell took Allport's list and narrowed it down to about 171 traits, then grouped those into 16 basic personality dimensions. Instead of saying a trait is either there or not there, you can measure where someone falls on a continuum for each trait. So you don't just label someone as outgoing or not outgoing, you ask how outgoing and in what range. Hans and Sybil Eysenck focused on temperament and argued that many aspects of personality are biologically based. They believed that our basic personality traits are influenced by genetic inheritance. They described two main personality dimensions. The first is introversion or extroversion. Someone high in extroversion is sociable and outgoing. Someone high in introversion has a strong need to be alone and prefers solitary activities. The second dimension is neuroticism stability. Someone high in neuroticism is more anxious and has a more reactive, easily triggered nervous system. Someone high in stability is more calm and emotionally steady. So in their view, a big part of personality can be understood by looking at where a person falls on these two dimensions. They propose that these two dimensions, extroversion versus introversion and emotional stability versus instability, can be used to explain differences in personality. If you map those two dimensions together, you get different general types based on the combinations. For example, someone who's high in extroversion and high in neuroticism would come across as outgoing but also intense, restless, or easily agitated. Someone who is high in introversion and high in stability would come across as quiet, calm, and emotionally controlled. The point is that you don't need dozens of categories. You can describe a lot of personality just by looking at where a person falls on those two traits. The five-factor model describes personality in terms of five broad traits, also called the Big Five. Everyone has all five traits. People can be higher or lower on each one, but everyone has them all. The first letters spell ocean: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness to experience describes how curious, imaginative, and open to new ideas a person is. Higher openness usually looks like creativity and interest in new experiences or new perspectives. Lower openness looks more traditional, more comfortable with routine. Conscientiousness is about self-control and responsibility. Higher conscientiousness looks organized, reliable, goal-focused, and careful about planning. Lower conscientiousness looks more spontaneous, more laid back, and sometimes more distractible. Extroversion is about social energy. Higher extroversion looks outgoing, talkative, and active around other people, while lower extroversion, so more introverted, looks quiet, reserved, and more comfortable recharging alone. Agreeableness is about how you treat other people. Higher agreeableness looks cooperative, warm, compassionate, and focused on keeping the peace in relationships. Lower agreeableness looks more competitive, more critical, and more focused on personal outcomes than on harmony. And finally, we have neuroticism, which is about emotional stability. Higher neuroticism means more anxiety, more mood swings, and more stress reactivity, and lower neuroticism means more emotional steadiness. In this model, personality is described by where you fall on each of these five traits and not by putting yourself in a single box. The HEXACO model is another trait model of personality, similar to the Big Five, but it adds a sixth trait called honesty-humility. Honesty-humility includes qualities like sincerity, fairness, and refusing to manipulate or exploit other people for personal gain. Someone high in honesty-humility is more likely to be straightforward and cooperative. Someone low in this trait is more likely to cheat, lie, or take advantage of people if it benefits them. HEXACO also includes traits that overlap with the Big Five, like emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And just like with the Big Five, each trait is measured on a continuum. The goal is not to put you into a category, but to describe where you fall on each of those traits. Culture is one of the most important environmental influences on personality. And when we say culture, we're talking about the beliefs, customs, traditions, values, and shared practices of a particular society. The question psychologists ask is whether personality traits are the same everywhere or if they change based on culture. And the answer is both. Some traits show up across cultures, and some traits are shaped by culture. For example, in many Asian cultures, which tend to be more collectivist, people are less extroverted on average. In Central and South American cultures, people tend to score higher on openness to experience. In many European samples, people tend to score higher in neuroticism. So what's considered normal or even desirable in a personality can shift depending on the culture somebody grows up with. Personality patterns also show up by region. Researchers have found that people in different parts of the United States tend to cluster in consistent ways. One cluster is often described as friendly and conventional, which is more common in the Midwest and parts of the South. Another cluster is described as relaxed and creative, which is more common in the West. A third cluster is described as more stressed, irritable, and depressed, which is more common in the Northeast. One explanation for this is selective migration. People don't just randomly end up where they live. People often choose to move to places that fit their personality, lifestyle, values, or needs. And over time, that creates regional personality patterns. Cultures also differ in what they value. Individualist cultures place a high value on independence, competition, and personal achievement. This pattern shows up most in Western nations such as the United States, England, and Australia. In these settings, people tend to show more personally oriented personality traits, traits that highlight the individual. Collectivist cultures place a high value on social harmony, respect, and the needs of the group over the needs of the individual. This pattern is more common in regions such as Asia, Africa, and South America. In these settings, people tend to show more socially oriented personality traits, so traits that focus on relationships, responsibility to others, and maintaining the group. Personality tests are used in a lot of real settings. They're used to screen applicants for certain jobs or training programs. They're used in court settings, including criminal cases and custody battles. They're also used to help assess psychological disorders. A common type is the self-report inventory. A self-report inventory is an objective test that measures personality using questions you answer about yourself. These tests often use multiple choice or numbered rating scales, sometimes called Likert scales. One of the most widely used is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. The MMPI was originally developed to help diagnose psychological disorders, and it's still widely used in clinical and legal settings. If you've ever taken a survey and they asked you to rate how much you agree or disagree with a statement on a scale, for example, 1 equals strongly disagree up to 5, which is strongly agree, you've used a Likert scale. Many personality tests use this format. You're given a statement and you're asked to rate how true it feels for you or how much you agree with it. This turns personality into something measurable. Instead of just describing yourself in conversation, you're giving consistent, scoreable responses that can be compared across people. The MMPI uses different styles of questions. Instead of a 1 to 5 scale, it uses true false. You're given a statement and you're asked to say whether it is true or false for you. The questions can sound very direct or even a little weird or odd on purpose because they're designed to pick up on patterns that are linked to different kinds of psychological concerns. These answers are then scored across several clinical scales. The pattern of scores can be used to help identify certain kinds of emotional or behavioral problems. This is why the MMPI shows up a lot in mental health settings, legal evaluations, and even high-stakes decisions. Projective tests are based on the idea of projection, which is a defense mechanism. The idea is that you're given something vague or ambiguous and asked to respond. You will project your own needs, fears, impulses, and conflicts into your answer, even if you don't realize you're doing it. In these tests, a person is shown something ambiguous and asked to interpret it, tell a story, or complete a sentence. For example, the Rorschach ink blot test uses a set of symmetrical ink blots, and the person is asked what they see in each one. Their responses are interpreted as a window into their unconscious concerns or struggles. The thematic apperception test shows pictures of people in different situations and asks the person to tell a story about what's happening. The way someone fills in that story can reflect their hopes, fears, motives, and view of relationships. And the Rotter incomplete sentence blank asks a person to quickly finish sentence stems like I feel or my father. The goal is to surface emotional themes the person might not directly be able to say. The Rotter incomplete sentence blank, or RISB, is a projective measure that asks people to complete unfinished sentences. You're given a sentence stem like I feel, fill in the blank, or my mother, fill in the blank, and you're asked to finish it as quickly and as honestly as you can. So it's more of a first instinct and not a I have to think about this kind of thing. The idea is that the way you complete the sentences gives information about what you're dealing with emotionally. Things like stress, anger, fear, conflict, or any unmet needs. Because you're generating the content yourself instead of choosing from options, it can reveal themes you might not say directly in a regular interview. Personality is the pattern in how you tend to think, feel, and act. Some of that comes from early experience, some of it's learned, some of it's biological. Some of it's shaped by culture and environment, and some of it shows up as traits that stay pretty steady over time. You've seen that different theories don't always agree on where personality comes from, but they're all trying to answer the same question. Why do people do what they do? As you're listening to other people describe you, you're dramatic, you shut down, you're controlling, you're sensitive, you're so independent, you're avoidant, you're always the responsible one. I want you to start asking yourself, is that a stable pattern in me, or is that how I act in certain situations? Does that come from how I was raised, from what I've had to survive, from how I see myself, or from what the specific environment demands of me? That kind of honesty matters in relationships, your work, your therapy, and how you treat yourself.